She was still in the driveway when I opened the front door. My name is Marcus. I'm 34 years old, and I had just spent 9 months at a forward operating base in eastern Syria doing things I won't describe in detail here. Not because I can't, but because that's not the story I'm telling. The story I'm telling starts on a Tuesday in March, in the driveway of a house I'd bought with my wife 7 years ago on a street in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the dogwood trees were just beginning to show white at the tips of their branches, and the air smelled like cut grass and rain that hadn't fallen yet. I came home 2 weeks early. A piece of shrapnel had made that decision for me. It caught me in the left shoulder during a perimeter breach in week 36. Not deep enough to do permanent damage, but enough to earn me a medical evacuation, a surgical team at Landstuhl, a week of recovery, and then a transport stateside with a folder of paperwork and a Purple Heart I didn't feel particularly heroic about receiving. The Army gave me 90 days of medical leave and told me to go home and rest. Nobody called Renee. I wanted to surprise her. I surprised her. I landed at Pope Field at 4 in the afternoon. Hector, my buddy from the unit, the one person I'd told about the early return, picked me up in his truck because I hadn't wanted to deal with the rental counter, and he drove me home without asking many questions, which is exactly what you want from a person in that moment. He pulled up to the curb, handed me my duffel, and said, "Call me if you need anything, brother." I told him I would. I watched him drive away, and then I stood on the sidewalk in front of my house for a moment, just looking at it. The house looked the same, slightly different, in the way that everything looks slightly different after 9 months. The bushes were fuller, the fence along the left side had new boards in it that hadn't been there before, the welcome mat was new. Small things. The kind of changes that accumulate while you're away and that you notice all at once when you return. I let myself in with my key. The house was quiet. Caleb was in school until 3, and I knew Renee had a full teaching day. I set my duffel in the hallway, walked through the living room slowly, touching things. The couch, the bookshelf, the framed photo of Caleb at the beach that I'd never seen before. It must have been taken in the summer. He looked bigger. That hit me harder than I expected, that photo. 9 months is a long time in a 5-year-old's life. I picked Caleb up from school myself. His teacher came out with the afternoon group, and he was near the back, dragging his backpack by one strap. And then he looked up and saw me, and the expression on his face was the kind of thing that makes everything else worth it. He ran at me full speed, and I caught him with my good arm and held him for a long time while other parents stepped around us on the sidewalk. We went home, made grilled cheese, watched half an animated movie. He fell asleep on the couch at 7:30 with his head on my leg. I sat in the dark with my son sleeping beside me and the television off, and I felt, in that moment, completely whole. I tried Renee's Celadate. No answer. I left a voicemail, deliberately vague. Just, "Hey, it's me. Give me a call when you can," because I still wanted the surprise of her walking in and finding us there. I tried again at 9:30. Still no answer. By 10 I had put Caleb to bed and come back to the living room, and was sitting in the dark with the specific alertness of a person who has been trained to notice when something is wrong and is trying very hard to believe nothing is. She pulled into the driveway at 11:47. I know the exact time because I checked my phone when I heard the car. She didn't come inside immediately. I could see her outline through the frosted glass panel beside the front door. She was standing by the car, not moving. And then I heard her voice, low and indistinct, saying something I couldn't make out from where I was sitting. A pause. Then the specific soft sound of another car door closing. Another car door. I stood up from the couch. I stood very still in the hallway, one hand against the wall, and I listened to my wife say goodnight to someone in our driveway at midnight. And then I heard footsteps on the front path, and the jingle of keys, and the door opened. She didn't turn the lights on immediately. She came in on muscle memory the way you enter your own home. And in the ambient glow from the streetlight, I saw her face the moment she registered my silhouette in the hallway. The sound she made was not the sound of a woman seeing her husband come home from war. It was the sound of someone who has just understood that the evening has gone irreversibly wrong. I need to go back. To understand what happened in that hallway, you need to understand what came before it. Not just the 9 months of deployment, but the 7 years of marriage that preceded it, and the particular kind of trust we had built, and the particular kind of blindness that trust can produce in a person. Renee and I met at a barbecue at Fort Bragg in the summer 9 years ago. She was there with her friend Carla, who was dating a guy in my unit, and I noticed her immediately. not because she was performing anything, but because she wasn't. She was standing near the cooler with a paper plate, watching the crowd with an expression of calm, slightly amused detachment, like someone who had decided to enjoy the afternoon on her own terms regardless of what it offered. I have spent a lot of time around people who perform confidence. It's practically a professional requirement in the Army, and genuine ease is instantly recognizable by contrast. I crossed the yard and talked to her for 3 hours. We were married 2 years later in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard in Wilmington. Her mother cried through the whole thing. My father shook my hand afterward with both of his, which was the most emotional I'd ever seen him. Renee wore a dress she'd found at a vintage shop and altered herself, and she was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen standing in afternoon light. We settled in Fayetteville because that's where the Army put me, and Renee adapted to that life with the same pragmatic grace she applied to most things. She got her teaching certification, found a position at Eastover Elementary, built a life for herself that was genuinely hers and not just an appendage of mine. I respected that enormously. Some wives on base dissolved into their husbands' careers. Renee was determinately, specifically herself, and I love that about her. Caleb came in year 3. He looked like her for the first several months, and then gradually started looking like both of us, which struck me as a small biological miracle every time I studied his face. He was a happy kid, curious, physical, prone to elaborate explanations of things he only partially understood. He called me daddy with the full weight of the word every time, and every time I heard it, I felt the particular vertigo of realizing how much you have to lose. The deployments were the cost of the life we'd chosen. Neither of us pretended otherwise. The first one, when Caleb was 8 months old, was brutal for both of us, but especially for Renee, who was managing a baby alone while working and trying to hold everything together. I came home to a woman who was exhausted in a way that went deeper than sleep, and it took us several months to find our footing again. We talked about it directly, which is what Renee did. She named things, which I'd learned to do because of her. We worked through it. The second deployment was harder in different ways, but easier in others. Caleb was older, more manageable. Renee had a stronger support network. Her sister Dana had moved to Fayetteville by then, which helped enormously. Dana was practical, funny, deeply loyal to Renee in a way that I always found reassuring. If Renee was struggling, Dana would tell me. We had that understanding. By the third deployment, our system was established. Weekly video calls on Sunday evenings when the time zones aligned. Voice messages when calls weren't possible. The shared journal app we'd set up where we'd each add entries, observations, small moments, things we didn't want to forget. Caleb's drawings, photographed and sent. A whole infrastructure of connection maintained over distance, carefully tended. I left in June. The deployment was projected for 11 months, with the possibility of extension. We said goodbye in the driveway, Caleb clinging to my leg, Renee with her arms around my neck, her forehead against mine. She smelled like the soap she always used, something light and clean with a trace of citrus. I memorized it the way you memorize things when you're not sure when you'll encounter them again. The first 4 months were ordinary, in the way that deployments are ordinary, an abnormal situation that becomes routine through sheer repetition. The calls were regular, warm, full of the texture of both our lives. Renee was starting a new unit with her class, something about ecosystems. Caleb had learned to ride his bike with the training wheels off. The neighbors 2 doors down had gotten a dog that Caleb was obsessed with. Small, vivid reports from a world that continued without me. It was around month 4 that the texture began to change. Subtly, the kind of change that you notice in the way you notice a very slight variation in temperature. Not enough to name immediately, but enough to register somewhere in the body before the mind catches up. The calls were still happening. She was still warm, still present. But there was something behind her eyes in the video calls that I hadn't seen before, a distraction that came and went, a sense that part of her attention was elsewhere. I told myself it was the school year ramping up. I told myself it was the accumulated weight of managing everything alone. Then one call, in the middle of month 4, Caleb mentioned the fence. He was sitting in Renee's lap, showing me a drawing he'd made. A house with a very large sun and a figure that I understood was meant to be me based on the fact that it had no hair, which is how he drew soldiers. And in the middle of explaining the drawing he said, without particular emphasis, "Daddy, Brett fixed our fence." Children say things without understanding their weight. They report the world as they find it, neutrally, without editorial selection. That neutrality is what makes them devastating sometimes. I looked at Renee. She was already composing her expression. I could see it, a micro-adjustment, a settling into readiness. She said, "Our neighbor, he's been really helpful. He's good with tools." She smiled. Easy. Explanatory. The smile of a woman providing context, not hiding anything. But the speed of it, the smoothness, that's what I stored. I didn't ask a follow-up question. I redirected to Caleb's drawing, asked him about the sun, told him it was the best sun I'd ever seen. He beamed. The call ended normally, warmly, with Renee saying she loved me and Caleb saying "come home, daddy" in that particular tone that requires a physical effort not to break. I sat in the FOB with the tablet in my hands after the call ended and thought about the name Brett for a long time. Looking back now, that was the first moment the architecture started to show stress fractures. I was looking directly at a warning signal and choosing to interpret it as structural noise. I had an investment in the building standing, so I told myself the cracks were cosmetic. Month 5 brought a change I noticed, but couldn't quite articulate at the time. The voice messages got shorter. This sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. Renee had always been expansive in those messages. They were one of the things I looked forward to most, because they had the quality of her actual thinking voice, unedited. The way she talked when she wasn't performing composure for a video call. She'd narrate her day in that circular, digressive way she had, going from the classroom to something Caleb said to something she'd been reading to a memory something had triggered, and the messages were sometimes 10 or 12 minutes long, and I listened to every second of all of them. By month 5, they were averaging 3 minutes. Still warm, still her voice, but focused, summarized, like a report rather than a conversation, like a woman who had thought about what she was going to say before she said it. I noticed the timestamps too. They were coming later, 9, 10, sometimes 11 at night. When I mentioned it, gently, she said she'd been staying up later. That Caleb's bedtime had pushed back a little. That the house was quieter after he went to sleep and those hours felt like her own. That was plausible. All of it was plausible. One of the things I've come to understand about sustained deception is that it doesn't require elaborate lies. It requires plausible truths, placed strategically. Renee was not an unintelligent woman. She understood instinctively what required explanation and what didn't. Dana called me in month 5. Dana and I had always had a direct relationship. She was Renee's sister, but she was also independently someone I liked, blunt and practical and genuinely caring in a way that didn't require performance. She called me on a Sunday morning, ostensibly just to check in, but the call had a quality to it that I recognized as purposeful. We talked about Caleb, about how Renee seemed, about whether I thought I'd get leave before the deployment ended. Then she said, "She's been spending time with the neighbor. Brett. I don't know him well, but he's around a lot." She said it carefully, factually. She wasn't accusing anyone of anything. She was giving me information, the way she would want someone to give her information. I asked how much time. Dana said, "I don't know, Marcus. I'm just telling you what I see." We didn't say much more about it. I thanked her, and we said goodbye, and I sat with what she'd given me for the rest of that day. There was a particular quality to sitting with information like that, a cold, steady weight, like holding something dense in both hands. You can feel how heavy it is before you know exactly what it is. I didn't change anything in my communications with Renee. I decided to watch, not act. Part of that was the distance. I was 6,000 miles away with no ability to do anything meaningful. And part of it was that I genuinely didn't know what I had yet. A neighbor who fixed fences and was around often was not, by itself, evidence of anything. I knew that. I had been trained to distinguish between signal and noise, and I was trying to apply that discipline to my own life, which is significantly harder than applying it professionally. Month 6. A video call where Caleb answered before Renee could get to the phone. He'd learned to swipe the screen. There were about 45 seconds of a tilted, wandering view of the living room, the couch, the bookshelf, the rug we'd argued about buying, before Renee came into frame and repositioned the camera. In those 45 seconds, I saw 2 things. A beer bottle on the coffee table, not my brand. A dark green canvas jacket on the arm of the couch. Renee appeared, and the camera angle shifted upward, and we had a 20-minute call that was warm and normal, and during which she did not mention that anyone had been at the house. The jacket and the bottle were not addressed, not explained, not even tangentially referenced. 20 minutes of conversation about Caleb's classroom, a movie she'd watched, whether I needed anything sent in a care package. I said nothing, not because I didn't want to. I didn't ask because I knew, in the way you know things before you can prove them, that asking would change something irreversible. The question, once asked, could not be unasked. And I was 6,000 miles away. I had no control over what happened next. So I said nothing, and I held the knowledge and I waited. I stopped sleeping as well after that. In an active forward operating base in eastern Syria, with legitimate external threats on multiple sides, what kept me awake was a dark green jacket on a couch in Fayetteville, North Carolina. I want to be honest about how absurd that is, and how completely it captures what betrayal does to a person. It reaches you anywhere, in any condition, and makes everything else secondary. Looking back, there was one other moment from that period I keep returning to. Month 7. A voice message from Renee, 9:42 at night. She was talking about something at school, a parent conference that had gone long, and in the background, just briefly, just for a moment, I heard something. A low sound. Not the television. Not Caleb, who would have been asleep by then. A sound that could have been the house settling, or could have been something else entirely. She didn't pause. Didn't react. Kept talking smoothly about the parent conference. I listened to that message 4 times. Then I put the tablet away and went to do my job, because that's what you do. You compartmentalize. You function. You carry things that would stop other people, and you keep moving because the alternative isn't available to you. The shrapnel hit my shoulder 3 weeks later and solved the problem of the distance. 19 hours of travel gives you a lot of time to think. I sat in airport terminals and on military transports with my arm in a sling and my mind running through everything with the methodical patience of someone who has been trained to prepare before acting. I wasn't angry yet, not really. The anger would come later, in a different form than I expected. What I felt in those 19 hours was something closer to clarity. A cold, focused attention, like the moment before an operation when all the ambient noise drops away and there is only the objective. I had decided not to tell Renee I was coming home early. I want to be precise about my reasons, because I've interrogated them since, and I think honesty matters here. Part of it was genuinely the desire to surprise her, to have Caleb's face when he saw me be unscripted. That part was real. But the other part, the part one didn't fully admit to myself until later, was that I needed to know what I would find. Not to catch anyone, not to construct a case. I just needed the truth, unedited, and I understood instinctively that advance notice would produce a performance rather than reality. So I said nothing. I landed. Hector drove me home. I've already told you what I found in the first hours. The empty house, Caleb from school, the grilled cheese, the animated movie, my boy asleep on my leg in the blue light of the television. Those hours were real and good, and I hold on to them. What came after belongs to a different category of memory. While Caleb slept, I walked through the house. I did this deliberately, methodically, the way you walk through a space you need to understand. The living room first, the new paint color she'd mentioned, a warm gray I didn't recognize, and the furniture subtly rearranged. Nothing dramatic, just different enough that I registered it consciously. The bookshelf had new books on it. The kitchen had a new coffee maker, a good one, a brand I didn't recognize. In the recycling bin under the sink, there were beer bottles. That brand, not mine. I checked the garage. My tools were where I'd left them. But on the workbench, placed there with the casual familiarity of someone who considered the space available to them, was a power drill I didn't own. DeWalt, newer model than mine. It was just sitting there, plugged into the wall charger. I unplugged it. I set it aside. I went back inside. The bedroom was the hardest room. I stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. Everything looked normal. Our bed, her nightstand with the small lamp and the book she was reading, the framed photo of Caleb above the dresser. But the room smelled different. Very slightly different, in a way that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been paying the specific attention I was paying. A trace of something. Not cologne exactly, more like the accumulated presence of a person. Faint, almost imperceptible. But I was in a profession where almost imperceptible mattered, and I noticed it. I didn't go through her things. I want to be clear about that. I stood in the doorway, registered what I registered, and left the room. There was a line I wasn't willing to cross, and going through her belongings was it. I had what I had. I carried Caleb to his room, got him into his bed without fully waking him, kissed his forehead. Went back to the living room. Turned off all the lights. Sat in the dark and waited. And now we're back to 11:47, to the driveway, to the sound of another car door. I had pulled aside the curtain slightly and watched while I waited. The car that had followed her in, a dark pickup truck, late model, parked across the street, sat there for about 4 minutes after her car went still. I couldn't see the driver clearly. Then the truck's engine started and it moved away slowly. No lights at first, which is a specific choice a person makes when they don't want to be noticed. Renee stood in the driveway for 30 seconds after the truck left. She was looking at the house. I watched her stand there, and I thought about all the Sunday nights she had sent me voice messages telling me she missed me. And I thought about how those two things, the voice messages and this driveway, belonged to the same person, and I tried to reconcile them, and I couldn't. She came inside. She found me in the dark hallway. She made the sound she made. I reached out and turned on the hallway light. She was dressed nicely. Not formally, but deliberately. Dark jeans, a blouse I recognized, earrings she wore for occasions. Her eyes were wide and her color was wrong. She was holding her keys so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She said my name. Just Marcus. The way you say a word when it's both a greeting and a confession. I said, hey. We stood in the hallway of our house and looked at each other, and the space between us was full of everything that hadn't been said in 9 months, and I could smell the cologne on her from 3 feet away. Not her soap. Something else. Something that had transferred. I said, Caleb's in bed. He was asleep by 7:30. She said, you're home. I said, I am. Another silence. Long. She looked at the floor once and then back at me, and I watched her assembling something. A version of this moment she could manage. I knew her face completely. I had studied it for 9 years. I could see the assembly happening in real time. I said, whose truck was that? She went still. I waited. That was Brett, she said. He gave me a ride because my car was making a noise and I didn't want to. Renee? I said her name quietly, not harshly, just to stop the sentence. She stopped. I said, I've been home for 7 hours. I had time to think. I'm not going to stand here and have you explain Brett's truck. I paused. I need you to tell me what I already know. The keys dropped from her hand onto the hardwood floor. The sound was very loud in the quiet house. She bent to pick them up, a reflex, and when she straightened I could see that her eyes had filled. She said, how long have you known? I said, long enough. We moved to the kitchen because the hallway felt too narrow for what was coming. She sat at the table. I made coffee, not because I wanted it, but because I needed something to do with my hands, and because the ritual of it gave us both 30 seconds to breathe. I set a cup in front of her and sat across from her, and in the overhead light, I could see her clearly, completely, in a way that somehow felt different from all the times before. Like the light had changed quality. Like I was seeing the actual shape of something I had only seen in shadow. She held the coffee mug with both hands. She looked at it. I said, start wherever you need to start. She started in October. Brett had moved onto the street in July, the month after I deployed. He was a contractor, self-employed, renovation work. He'd introduced himself at the block association meeting. She'd mentioned him briefly. I remembered now, though the detail had dissolved in the larger noise of deployment life. He had helped the elderly woman at the end of the street with a roof issue. He had helped the family across from us with a flooring problem. He was the kind of neighbor who showed up practically, without being asked, without drama. Caleb had liked him immediately. Children and dogs, she said, they don't dissemble. She stopped and looked up at me. I said, keep going. It had started with proximity, she said. He was around. She was alone. He fixed the fence boards I'd noticed when I arrived. And afterwards she'd invited him in for coffee to say thank you. They'd talked for 2 hours. She said that she'd felt, in that conversation, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not a romantic feeling, she said, not at first, but seen. She said that word specifically, seen, like he was paying attention in a particular way. I listened. I kept my face still. She said it had developed slowly. Through October, November, dinners at the house after Caleb was in bed. She said she had told herself it was friendship, and she had believed that for longer than was reasonable. Then in December she had stopped telling herself that. I said, he's been at this house while Caleb was here. She said, not. I was always careful. He's been at this house, I said again. Not a question. She looked at the table. Yes. Something hardened in me at that. Not the affair itself, as terrible as that was, It was between two adults. But Caleb had been in the house. Caleb had watched his mother's routines built around another man's schedule. Caleb had told me, with the cheerful neutrality of a 5-year-old, that Brett fixed the fence, and in doing so had told me everything, without knowing he was telling me anything. My son had been living inside this secret. I got up from the table and stood at the sink with my back to her for a moment. I looked out the window at the backyard, the swing set in the dark, the sandbox, the fence with its new boards. I breathed carefully, in through the nose, out through the mouth. A technique that works in the field and was working, marginally, here. I turned back around. I said, "Does Dana know?" A pause. She suspected. Did she know? Renee looked up at me. She saw his truck a few times. She asked me about it once. What did you tell her? That he was a friend. I thought about Dana's call, month 5. The careful, factual quality of it. I don't know him well, but he's around a lot. She had known, or strongly suspected, and she had called me because she thought I deserved the information and she had not known how to give it to me more directly than she did. I understood that. I didn't hold it against her. I sat back down. I said, "What did you want, Renee?" When I came home, what was going to happen? She was quiet for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside a car moved through the neighborhood. She said, "I don't know. I think I kept waiting for it to resolve itself." That's not an answer. I know, she said. I know it isn't. What followed was 3 hours of the hardest conversation I've ever had. And I've had conversations in the field that involve consequences I won't describe. This was different. This was the dismantling of a structure I had spent 7 years building, conducted in a quiet kitchen with coffee going cold on the table and my son asleep upstairs. She didn't minimize. She didn't perform remorse in the theatrical way I'd half expected. What she did was answer every question I asked, directly, without evasion, which was either an act of integrity or an act of someone who understood that evasion was no longer available to her. She had told Brett, she said, that she needed to stop. She had told him that before I came home, before she knew I was home. Sometime in February, she had ended it. I asked when. She said, 3 weeks ago. I thought about what 3 weeks ago meant. It meant she had ended it, and then continued her normal life, and continued sending me voice messages, and had not told me. 3 weeks ago, she had made a decision that affected my entire life, and she had kept that to herself. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because I was afraid of losing you." I looked at her face. She meant it. The fear was real. And I understood, sitting there, that you could hold two completely incompatible truths at the same time. That she had loved me throughout this, in whatever way she was capable of, and that the love had not been sufficient to stop any of it. Those two things were both true, and together they made the situation worse, not better. It would have been easier, in a specific way, if the love had simply been absent. If she had been indifferent to me, the math would have been simpler. Instead, I was sitting across from a woman who had wept at our son's birth, who had held my hand through difficult nights, who had maintained the infrastructure of our marriage over distance with apparent care, and who had also, simultaneously and with administrative precision, built a parallel life in the space my absence created. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't entirely. At 2 in the morning, I told her I needed to sleep. I needed the conversation to stop, not because it was finished, but because I had reached the limit of what I could process in a single night. I had been traveling for 19 hours. I had a surgical wound that was beginning to ache in a way I'd been ignoring. I was at the end of my capacity. I told her I would sleep in the spare room. She said, "Marcus." I said, "Not tonight." And I walked down the hall and closed the door. I lay in the spare room in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the Purple Heart sitting in my duffel bag in the hallway. I thought about the 36 weeks I'd spent in a forward operating base, maintaining, through discipline and habit, a picture of a life that had been quietly transforming into something else. I thought about the jacket on the couch, the beer bottles in the recycling, the power drill on my workbench, plugged into my wall, charging on my electricity, belonging to a man who had been sleeping in my house. I thought about Caleb saying Brett fixed our fence with his complete, innocent neutrality. I did not sleep for a long time. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life, which is saying something given my professional history. We existed in the house in a kind of suspended state, two people maintaining the routines of a family for the sake of a 5-year-old who was thrilled to have his father home and had no understanding of the cold weather system moving through the rooms around him. We made breakfast. We did drop-off and pick-up. We ate dinner together 3 nights out of 7. We spoke in the measured, careful tones of two people who had agreed, without explicitly agreeing, not to do further damage until they knew what they were doing. Caleb was the organizing principle of those 2 weeks. He was the reason we were both still in the same house, and we both understood that, and neither of us said it out loud. He wanted to show me everything he'd learned while I was gone. His bike, his new reading level, a card trick Renee's father had taught him over Thanksgiving. I watched all of it with the full attention it deserved, and with a grief running underneath that he couldn't see. Hector came by on the 4th day. He sat on the back porch with me for 2 hours, drinking beer, saying relatively little. He had been through his own version of this. Not infidelity, but a divorce that had its own architecture of quiet devastation, and he didn't try to advise me or provide resolution. He just stayed. That was the right thing. Dana called me directly on the 5th day. I answered. She said, "I should have told you more directly when I called." I said, "You told me what you could." She said, "I'm so sorry, Marcus." I believed her. Here's the unexpected thing. The thing that reframes, at least partially, what I thought I understood. On day 9, Renee's mother called. June. June had always liked me. We had a genuine warmth, not a performed one, and her opinion mattered to Renee in ways that Renee didn't always admit. June called me directly, not Renee, which was unusual. She asked how I was. We talked for a few minutes, and then she said something that stopped me. She said, "Renee called me in December. She was in a bad place. She told me she felt like she was disappearing." I said, "What do you mean, disappearing?" June said, "She said she felt like she existed only in relation to you and Caleb. That there was no version of herself that was just herself. She was a wife and a mother, and she loved both of those things, but she said she felt like the actual person inside them was getting smaller." I sat with that. June said, "I'm not excusing anything. I want to be clear about that. What she did was wrong, and she knows it. But I thought you should know that she wasn't. She wasn't happy before Brett. She was struggling with something that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with herself, and she made a terrible choice as a response to it. I think she thought Brett was evidence that she still existed as a person." I didn't respond for a moment. Then I said, "She could have told me." June said, "I know. I told her that too. This information didn't change the facts. It didn't repair anything. But it did something to my understanding of the shape of what had happened. It added a dimension I hadn't seen from inside my own pain. Renee had not betrayed me out of indifference or out of simple desire. She had been in a kind of private dissolution that she hadn't known how to name, and she had reached for the nearest thing that made her feel real, and it had been another person, and she had let it run far too long because naming it would have required her to name the dissolution underneath it, and she wasn't ready to do that. I understood that. I didn't forgive it, but I understood it. On day 14, I told her I needed to move out for a while. I wasn't saying divorce. I was saying that I couldn't think clearly in this house, in this arrangement, and I needed physical space to understand what I wanted. She didn't argue. She looked at me with a steadiness that was also grief and said, "Whatever you need." I stayed with Hector for 6 weeks. In those 6 weeks, I did several things. I saw a therapist, a veteran-specific counselor at the VA who had heard worse things than mine and who had the specific quality of not performing sympathy. I talked to a lawyer, not to initiate anything, but to understand my options. I went back to light duty at base, which gave me structure. I saw Caleb every other day, without fail, picking him up from school and taking him to the park or for ice cream, or just driving around while he narrated the world through the window. Caleb never mentioned Brett. Not once. Whether Renee had explained something to him, or whether the man had simply stopped appearing in his field of vision, I don't know. Children adapt. They rebuild their understanding of normal around whatever is currently true. I watched my son do that with the uncanny resilience of the very young, and I felt something complicated and loving about his adaptability. Renee texted regularly. Not pleading texts. She was too controlled for that. Updates about Caleb, logistics, the house. Occasionally something more personal. "I've been seeing a therapist. I know that doesn't fix anything. I just wanted you to know." Or, "I think about what I said in the kitchen about disappearing. I think I've been working backward from there." I read all of them. I responded to the practical ones. For the personal ones, I took longer. At the end of the 6 weeks, I had arrived at a clarity that had cost me something to reach. The marriage was over. Not because I couldn't imagine forgiving her. I could imagine it, in the abstract, in the way you can imagine a country you've never been to. But because what June had told me made the situation larger, not smaller. Renee had been struggling with something fundamental about her own identity, the dissolution of herself into the role she occupied, and she had not brought that to me. She had carried it privately, let it grow privately, and responded to it privately. And in doing so, she had excluded me from something that was central to her life. That exclusion, I realized, was the actual betrayal. The affair was the symptom. The real wound was that she had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was not someone she could bring her real self to. I don't know if that's true. I've examined myself thoroughly for whether I contributed to that feeling, whether something in how I operated created a distance she couldn't cross. I can identify things I would do differently. I was not a perfect partner, but I was a present one, or as present as my profession allowed, and I would have listened. I want to believe that. I do believe it. She called me in April. Not a text, a call. I answered. She said, "I'd like to talk about what we do next. Together, if that's something you're open to." I said, "Renee, I need to tell you something." She waited. I said, "I've been thinking about this for 6 weeks. I've thought about it more carefully than I've thought about most things in my life. And what I keep coming back to is that I don't know how to rebuild trust with someone who didn't trust me enough to tell me she was struggling. Not the affair, the thing underneath it. You were disappearing and you didn't tell me. I found out from your mother." She was quiet. I said, "I think you need to do the work you're doing for yourself. I think that's genuinely the right thing. But I can't be the destination you're working toward. I can't be what you're rebuilding yourself in order to come back to. That puts something on me I can't hold." A long silence. Then, is this final?" I said yes. She said, "Okay." And then, after a moment, "Marcus, I'm sorry. I know that's not enough. I'm sorry." I said, "I know you are." We were on the phone for a few more minutes, working out the practical things, how to talk to Caleb, what the next steps looked like, who to call first. We were, in that conversation, two people who had loved each other for a long time doing their best to end something with as little additional damage as possible. There is a kind of dignity in that, I think, even when it hurts. We divorced 6 months later. It was not acrimonious. We had lawyers, we had mediation, we had two people who had made an agreement to put Caleb first and who kept that agreement. He splits time between us. He is doing fine. He is 6 now, still drawing elaborate pictures, still performing card tricks, still narrating the world to anyone who will listen. He calls me daddy with the full weight of the word, which has not changed. Renee and I communicate like two people who were once close and are now something else, something that doesn't have a clean name. We are civil. Sometimes we are even warm. At Caleb's school events, we stand near each other, and we are both present for him. And I think that is the best version of what we became. I still have the Purple Heart. It's in a box in my closet. I don't display it. It represents something real that I went through, but it doesn't represent the hardest thing I went through in that period, which was not in Syria at all. What I learned, not as a lesson you could put in a list, but as something I carry differently now, is that you can be completely present in a life and still be absent from the parts of it that matter most to another person. I was there, in every way I knew how to be. But Renee was living something interior that she had sealed off, and I had been so trusting of the surface that I hadn't looked for the seal. I don't blame myself for that, but I understand it now. Presence is not the same as access. The other thing I carry is this. Caleb told me about the fence. A 5-year-old, with no understanding of what he was saying, handed me the first piece of the truth in the most ordinary possible way because he had no reason to hide it. Children tell you what they see. They don't editorialize, don't manage, don't calculate the effect of the information. They just tell you. I think about that sometimes. About how the truth was always in the room. It just needed someone who didn't know to keep a secret. Last spring, I was sitting on my back porch. I have a different house now, closer to base, smaller, mine, and my phone buzzed with a photo from Caleb. He was at Renee's, and he had drawn another picture, and he'd photographed it himself and sent it to me without being prompted. It was a picture of a house with a large sun and 2 figures standing outside it. One tall, one small. The tall one had a specific marking on its left shoulder that I recognized, after a moment, as his attempt to draw a scar. He had drawn my shoulder. He had drawn us. I sat with that picture for a long time in the spring light. The neighborhood around me was quiet, the way it gets on weekend mornings. A dog went by on a leash. The dogwood in the front yard was in full bloom, white against the pale sky. I sent him back a message that said, "That's the best picture I've ever seen." He sent back, "I know, Daddy." I laughed. For the first time in a while, it surprised me. What this story is really about is not infidelity in the conventional sense. It is about two people who built a life together and grew, over time, into versions of themselves that no longer knew how to reach each other. In the catastrophic way, that gap was eventually bridged. Renee's betrayal was not born of calculation. It was born of a private erosion that she had been managing alone for longer than the affair itself. June's revelation, that Renee felt she was disappearing inside her roles, reframes everything that came before it. The affair with Brett was not a statement about Marcus. It was a statement about Renee's relationship with herself. She had, somewhere in the accumulation of deployments and motherhood and the particular loneliness of waiting, lost her sense of existing independently. Brett did not offer her romance as a replacement for Marcus. He offered her reflection, someone who saw her as a specific person, not a supporting role in someone else's narrative. That she responded to that by dismantling her marriage is the tragedy. That she didn't bring the dissolution to Marcus first is the actual betrayal. Marcus's position is more complicated than it appears. He is the wrong party in every technical sense. But he is also a man who was, by training and temperament, highly capable of managing things internally and less capable of creating the kind of emotional access that might have let Renee bring her struggles to him. This is not a cause of what she did. There is no version in which her choices were his fault, but it is a dimension of how the situation was able to develop as far as it did. Healthy relationships require a particular kind of porousness, the ability to bring your interior life to another person without managing how it lands. Both of them, in their different ways, had developed habits of internal management that kept the real conversation from happening. The deployment structure amplifies this. Military marriages exist in a compressed dynamic that civilian relationships rarely encounter. Long absences, maintained by the infrastructure of scheduled connection, followed by abrupt returns that require rapid recalibration. The video calls, the voice messages, the journal app, all of these are genuine and valuable, and all of them are also curated. They are the managed version of a relationship, not the living version. Real intimacy requires friction, proximity, the ungoverned moments that happen when two people occupy the same space. None of that is available across 6,000 miles. What Renee experienced as disappearing was, at least partly, the specific loneliness of performing a marriage across a screen while physically alone. The chain of small revelations, the fence, the jacket, the green canvas coat, the beer bottles, the timestamps, is the story's structural spine. Each detail was individually dismissible. Together they formed a pattern that Marcus could read and chose, for a time, not to read. That choice was not weakness or stupidity. It was the rational response of a man whose operational capacity depended on not being destabilized by what he couldn't confirm. He compartmentalized the uncertainty the same way he compartmentalized the professional risks of his work, because functioning required it. The cost of that compartmentalization was 6,000 miles and 9 months in which the information he needed was accumulating just beyond the frame of every video call. What makes the ending honest rather than simply sad is Marcus's precision about what was actually broken. He does not leave because of the affair. He leaves because of the prior withdrawal, the decision Renee made, somewhere in the long year of that deployment, to stop bringing her real self to him. That decision made the affair possible. It also made reconciliation, in any meaningful sense, structurally unsound. You cannot rebuild trust with someone who did not trust you enough to be honest when they were struggling. That is not a rule or a principle. It is what Marcus understood, slowly and painfully, across 6 weeks in Hector's spare room. He had the discipline to name it clearly, and the courage to act on what he named. What sits with me most about this story isn't the betrayal itself, it's June's phone call. The detail that Renee had been disappearing inside her own life, and had told her mother about it, and had not told Marcus. That gap, between what we share with the people closest to us and what we keep sealed away, is where most real damage lives. Not in grand acts of deception, but in all the smaller decisions not to speak. There's something worth sitting with in that. Not as judgment of Renee. She was clearly in pain, and pain makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do. but as a question worth asking in any long relationship. Are you actually telling each other the truth, or are you managing a version of it? Are you letting the other person see the places where you're struggling, or are you keeping those sealed until the pressure builds high enough to find its own exit? Marcus asked for honesty and got it, too late, and in the wrong order. The saddest part is that he would have listened from the beginning. He just never got the chance.